So we're on to lecture 6, second last one, and I've entitled it Bring on the Mysticists. And I realized when I was reviewing my notes late last night that I had repeated a few topics on this, so I'll skip them as we get to them. So if you look at your outline, I already dealt with reinstalling God on the human hard drive. We did that yesterday, actually. And I looked at ritual yesterday, and I looked at lessons from trees and butterflies. So I'm going to skip those sections, which will give me more time to expand on the other pieces. So let me begin then with empirical mysticism. And as I pointed out yesterday, mysticism there's a science to it, and therefore it's empirically, important to kind of be able to test what we're doing and how effective what we're doing might be. So when I talk about mysticism, the image that comes to mind for me is as a kid growing up in Ireland, there were homes in Ireland in which the fire was never allowed to go out. And so it stayed lit literally for 300-400 years. And what would happen is at night, the mother would be the last person to go to bed. And so we always had turf fires, what you guys here call peat fires. And so what she would do is she'd bring the glowing embers together in the center of the hearth and then cover it with fine kink or fine ashes to keep it insulated during the night. And then she'd be the first person up in the morning, and she'd rake back and she'd blow on the embers and put fresh peat on it, and it would burst into flames again. So literally there were homes in which the fire had not gone out for several hundred years. Now, I believe that that's the job of the mystics and the mysticists, that their job is to kind of blow upon, to hold the glowing embers under the onslaught of sometimes of fundamentalist religion and sometimes under fundamentalist secularism, and that the job of the mystics and the mysticists is to hold this space, to protect it, so that at some stage when we kind of wake up and become a little bit more enlightened, that we can rake back the ashes and blow upon the embers and add more fuel to the fire. And I believe that that's the job of people whom I call mysticists in our time, that our job is to try to ferret out where the glowing embers have been stored by the mystics of the past, and rake back the ashes that have occluded the heat, and then stack on our own particular abilities onto that and create a brand new fire. So we're dealing then with fundamentalist religion, and we're dealing with fundamentalist secularism in trying to protect the precious gift of realization that we're source beings. So mysticism then, I think, can kind of grant us what I call in science, there's the kind of the search for what's called the TOE, T-O-E, meaning the theory of everything. And one of my favorite authors is a guy called Tom Campbell, and he wrote a huge big tome. It's about maybe 1,500 pages called My Big Toe, literally my big theory of everything. And it's an amazing compendium. And so it's an effort science has been struggling mightily in the last 100 years to unite the four basic forces to try to create, they call that a theory of everything. So we're talking about gravity, electromagnetism, the weak force, and the strong force. So they've been trying desperately to find some kind of an elegant formula that can unite these four in the same way that Einstein's famous formula put together science, space, time, energy, and matter. So this is the search for the big toe. Now, the big toe, as far as I'm concerned, is a much bigger toe than kind of materialistic science is looking for. It's the search for a theory of literally everything that will unite both the physical and the metaphysical, that will unite both, as I said earlier today, the cosmos and the cosmos. The Greeks spelled cosmos two ways. When they spelled it with a C, it meant the physical universe. And when they spelled it with a K, it meant the metaphysical underpinnings of which the physical universe is simply a printout or a hard copy. And so for me, this would be a theory of everything that unites the transcendent and the immanent, that we can experience God in both forms. It is a theory, I believe, that will part the veil, which we talk about in Gaelic, this ÓLaoire, this veil, this mystical veil that kind of separates. It's almost diaphanous, but it separates the mystical from the mundane and the sacred from the secular. Therefore, as far as I'm concerned, the theory of everything is not just about uniting the four basic forces of the physical universe. It's a much bigger theory than that. And it's one that finally will liberate us from, the darkness and expose us to the light. Yesterday, I spoke about how we can empirically try to validate a kind of entry into that kind of space. And I used the example of just sitting in rooms such as this. And so I'm looking at the far corner at the bottom where the floor joins the walls. And I see that as 0.0. And then the wall that's going to my right, I'm going to call it the x-axis. And the wall that goes to my left, I'm going to call it the y-axis. And the line that joins the floor to the ceiling, I'm going to call it the z-axis. And I ascribe different kind of attributes to all three. So for me, the x-axis represents compassion, and we start off at 0. As neonates, we have to be totally self-engrossed. We are absolute narcissists, and it behooves us to be so, because without that, we wouldn't even survive the first few months of life. So we crave attention, we crave love, we crave milk, we crave mother's embrace. And so we start off with that in the corner. But at some stage, we keep moving along at this axis until finally, we're more concerned about others than we are about ourselves, are more concerned about the planet than we are about, maybe our own individual community. And so we wind up finally when we max out on the x-axis, we're looking at Mother Teresa's of the world, people who literally dedicate their lives compassionately for others. So that's one measure of the movement. The y-axis for me represents the axis of freedom. And as I pointed out, there's a huge difference between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as pleases me. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. And so the only really free person is the person who's constantly acting on God's behalf. And in some senses, that's kind of almost like divine narcissism, because we realize that I am God and you are God and everybody is God and everything is God. And so when I act on behalf of God, I'm acting on behalf of all that is. And so again, I look at how much, progress has an individual made along that, because there's a whole lot of people who are stuck at the addictive level of that. It's all about me, free will, in the sense of how can I do what benefits me, and so I don't have any freedom. So I'm addicted to something, power or, sex or alcohol or whatever it might be. And so the movement along the freedom axis is a second measure of this evolutionary trajectory. And then the third one, which joins the floor to the ceiling, the z-axis, has to do with the self-awareness. And that is, how do I think of myself? Am I a skin-encapsulated ego? Do I identify with my emotions? Do I identify with my thoughts? Do I identify with my relationships? Do I identify with my profession? Or when I talk about me, what do I mean? So for me, there are 3 levels to that process, 3 just categories. There's lots of ways of dividing, but for me, I divide it into 3 ways. And the first one is I call my role self, the part I'm playing in this present incarnation, a guy with an Irish accent. So that's my role self. And then there's my soul self, who I really am, the bite-sized piece of God, the holographic fractal that was never born and that will never die. That's a second level of self-identification. And then there's a third level, which is my source self, realizing that in some senses, I am just God playing hide and go seek with herself, and that everything that exists is simply God and drag. And so coming to that conclusion, so where along that axis am I operating from? And obviously, if we can max out along all axes, you find yourself at the ceiling in the top corner right here. You've maxed out on X, on compassion, you've maxed out on freedom, and you've maxed out on self-awareness. And now you're a Jesus figure, what I call a Homo Christus. And so that's the objective of the exercise, to get to that place eventually. And we can all gauge exactly where we are, just measuring, how far along the x-axis am I? How far along the y-axis am I? And how far along the z-axis am I? So when I think about empirical mysticism, I think then that mysticism is not just about narcissistic navel-gazing. It's a real science. And like any science, it has to be measurable and falsifiable. And at that stage, then, I reworked Einstein's formula many years ago. E equals mc squared. And now when I think about this, E stands not for energy, but for enlightenment. And M stands, not for mass as in matter, but for the mass of humanity, all sentient beings, all articulations of source. And C squared is the speed of God's love for us multiplied the speed of our love for each other. And so for me, when I look at that formula now, it's an invitation into a mystical unpacking of that. It's enlightenment measured by the mass of the awakening humanity and the love that we experience from God and the love that we give to each other. So that's what I mean then by empirical mysticism. And we look then at the inner kind of language of mysticism. So one of the things we realize is that mystics really don't talk, that unless they have to be teachers, and then they're forced into speak to the rest of us. But that the ultimate mysticist is his form of communication is utter silence. So there's a progress through the kinds of languages we employ in the kind of pursuit of the evolution of mysticism in our lives. So I'm going to divide them into elementary mysticism and then full enlightenment. So elementary mysticism for me is when source is in conversation with soul. And it is an inarticulatable, ineffable experience, because at that stage, there are no signifiers to speak about the Ferdinand Lassur's. There are no mental images employed in this dialogue. And there's not even a signified, there's not even an image in the head. It is basically a God speaking to herself. That's the elementary mysticism. Full enlightenment then is when we are being had by the experience. We're not having an experience, we're being had by the experience. And basically, this is just an internal dialogue that source is having with itself. So in the synopsis form, we have ordinary language where we employ reference, the objects in the outside world, and then signifieds, the mental images we create of the referent in the outside world. And then we have the signifiers, the language we employ in order to communicate our internal images to other people. That's kind of ordinary language. Telepathy then is different. It's one step up, because in telepathy, there are reference, there's the outside world, and there are the signifieds, there's the internal image, but there are no signifiers. I'm not employing language anymore. And so I'm taking the signifieds, the internal images inside my own brain, and I'm transmitting them to somebody else without ever employing any form of signifiers. Now, when we get to mysticism, there aren't even reference. There are no signifiers necessary. There's no signifieds. There's no internal image, and there are no reference. There's actually nothing out there in mysticism. And so basically, it's a form of unity consciousness. There's no need for reference, there's no need for signifieds, and there's no need for signifiers. It's basically God's internal dialogue. And then full enlightenment is the permanent identification with that state of being. So that's where kind of the language then of we're talking about when we have to talk about mystical experiences. That's basically what I have in mind. So I'm going to skip the ritual session and the lessons from trees and butterflies. I dealt with those yesterday. And I'm going to go straight on to Cymatics. About 20 years ago, there was a city in Belgium which was celebrating its 1000th anniversary as a chartered city. And so they engaged this very well-known musician, international musician, to compose music for the occasion. And instead of composing music, he set up a series of acoustical experiments. And so one of them, he clamped a sheet of plate glass, 8 feet long by 4 feet high by about an inch thick, and he clamped it in an upright position. And then he got warm, soapy water, and he poured it along the spine. Imagine this is a sheet of plate glass, except it's 8 feet long by 4 feet high by an inch thick. And he poured lots of warm, soapy water along the crest here so that it flowed down on both sides of the pane of glass. And then he had musicians come up and play music in front of the glass. And because of the vibration of the acoustical vibration of the sound, it created all these extraordinary patterns in the glass. And depending on the pitch of the instrument and the instrument that was being employed, you got totally different kind of patterns being created. So that's what Cymatics is about. Cymatics is the science of generating patterns through acoustical kind of bombardment. That's basically what it is. So there's a whole science here, whereby kind of having sound vibrations of different frequencies addressing different media. Water, for instance, you can produce visible patterns, at various levels of complexity. Now, as you change the frequency, the pattern initially dissolves into chaos. So you got a beautiful pattern appearing on the glass or in the medium. Like if you have a bowl of water on the table and you put a sound system underneath the table, you see all these ripples on the water top, and it creates all these extraordinary patterns. And when you change the frequency, the pattern disappears until you keep changing, and then a much more complex pattern emerges. So you have to watch kind of the original pattern dissolve into nothingness in order to create space to generate a much more complex pattern. And one of the extraordinary things they've discovered over the years is that in many cases, the patterns that are generated became the symbols that many languages employed in their written alphabets. Literally, when you look at, for instance, an alphabet like the Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 symbols in the Hebrew alphabet, and some of them are actually generated by watching the vibration on a water that's been subjected to acoustical, bombardment. And so the same thing, I imagine, may be true in the symbols of Aramaic, in the symbols of Sanskrit, that actually many of the symbols they adopted were not kind of invented ex nihilo, that they were actually discovered from nature and from watching patterns emerge from these kind of acoustical bombardments. And so the process for me is fascinating, that we have to suffer the dissolution of the initial patterns and fear that there may not be another pattern emerge. We have to suffer that in order to realize that a much more complex pattern actually will emerge. And that's, my vision for these times, that the times in which we live, that the pattern of our present configuration of doing life on planet Earth, we've grown used to it. It's now beginning to dissolve down into chaos. And this is a necessary transition into a much more complex pattern of life. And so, but we have to have the courage to confront and to transform and to see through. So we have to continue to raise the frequency. We have to have the courage to patiently survive the intermittent chaos. And then we have to give birth to a higher order of reality. And that ultimately is the whole meaning of the word compassion in Aramaic. When Jesus says famously in Luke's gospel, you must be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. It's written in Greek, but Jesus is speaking in Aramaic. And the word that he's using for father, Ab1 in Aramaic, doesn't mean a kind of a gender-specific daddy. It actually means the birthing principle of the cosmos, that which gave birth to all that is. And compassion, the word for compassion in Hebrew and Aramaic is the word rachamim. And rachamim is the plural of the word for a womb. And so here's what Christ is saying: you must be womb-like, as the birthing principle of the cosmos is itself a womb. So what does a womb do? It conceives and it carries and it nurtures and it births sequentially, not just once, but can do it many, many times. So being womb-like means having the perspicacity to keep giving birth. So initially, at about age 8 months, we give birth to an ego. And then we give birth, to kind of a role in the family, or we give birth to kind of our job or our relationships. So we're constantly birthing various versions of ourselves. And what Christ is saying is, you can't stop giving birth until you give birth to God. That's the entire objective of incarnation, is to give birth to God. And so we have to experience the kind of the pain of being pregnant, the contractions, the labor pains, in order to believe that at the end of it, something really beautiful is going to emerge. And so those are the times in which we find ourselves, as far as I'm concerned. We're beings who have committed to compassion, to giving birth to God. And Meister Eckhart said that much more famously in the 1300s, when he said, of what use to me is it that my Savior was born of a virgin 1300 years ago? If he's not born again in my time and in my heart, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God. So every single one of us literally is meant to be the mother of God. So when I look then at the notion of chaos and randomness, what happens when the pattern dissolves and there's apparent chaos, and we wonder, is this the end? I heard a brilliant interview between Bruce Lipton and Greg Braden some months ago, in which they had the discussion of the difference between randomness and chaos. So I attribute this understanding to them. So randomness is the complete lack of order in a system. That's what we mean by randomness. And so we're attempting to do that in scientific inquiry, to try to create random controlled double-blind experiments. They never are truly random. But true randomism is the total absence of order in a system. Now, chaos is very different. Chaos appears to be synonymous with randomness. It's really, really different. Chaos means that there's an unseen level of organization in the data that give the appearance of being random. It looks to be totally random, but there's a much, much deeper level of complexity to it. And so there's a whole new branch of mathematics called chaos theory, where you're looking at the underlying intelligence that's driving the patterns that appear to be totally random. I drove here this morning and it's lashing rain, and I'm watching rain kind of course down my window. Mathematically speaking, I'm looking at a chaotic system. There's a reason why one drop goes in that direction, another drop runs straight down, and another drop goes across to my right. And the reason is that the complexity of the windscreen, because of its composition, is providing a kind of temporary impediments to various raindrops. And so according as they meet a particular impediment, depending on the wind that's driving it and the force of the rain, and flies on the windscreen or whatever, is going to take a different route. So to me, looking out, it appears to be totally random process. They're just going all over the place. But there's a much, much higher intelligence that's factoring in wind speed, and impediments on the screen, and the composition of the screen, and the speed at which I'm driving. That's determining where every single drop, the trajectory every single drop is going to take. And so what appears to be an utterly random process, a chaotic process, is actually being orchestrated by an extraordinarily deep, intelligent system. And that's what we mean by chaos theory in mathematics. So chaos then becomes a necessary step in order to reach higher levels of organization. And I spoke yesterday about dissipative structures. There's brilliant Belgian, Russian biochemists who won the Nobel Prize for Biochemistry in 1977, I believe, for a theory that was able to kind of make sense of an apparent contradiction in science between entropy and evolving complexity. Why is it that if the second law of thermodynamics tells us that all systems, all closed systems left to their own devices, run themselves down into randomness, why is it that more and more complex life forms are emerging on the planet? And so he solved that with a theory that he called dissipative structures. And what he found out was that, that if you take the existing elements of any system and you dismantle them and you reorganize them in a different combination, you don't have to add anything, and you don't have to subtract anything, but you can create much, much more complex systems. And I might give you some simple examples about that. That if you take a jigsaw puzzle, and you assemble it, and you find at some stage you've got 15 holes in it, and there's 45 pieces left over, and where you try to put them, they won't fit, and you realize, oh my God, there's a whole bunch of pieces I put in, and they're in the wrong positions, and I have to disassemble whole chunks of the puzzle and now redistribute them. And at this stage, if I do it correctly, if I recombine them in a different configuration, there are no holes left and there are no pieces left over. And I've created the picture that was on the box. And so I didn't add anything and I didn't subtract anything. I merely recombined the elements. And as I pointed out, this is the notion of the god Shiva in the Hindu Trinity, that Brahma represents creation, and Vishnu represents homeostasis, and Shiva represents the dismantling of the existing configuration in order to recombine it and create a much more complex phenomenon. So that's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the Christian version. And so chaos then is the process through which apparent randomness is a stage on the road to higher complexity. Now, I believe that these are the kinds of times in which we live, that we have to create the next stage in our evolutionary trajectory by being willing to dismantle existing systems, because they're random. They're not just chaotic. It's not that they're being driven by a higher intelligence that we still haven't figured out. It's that the old systems are breaking down. We have a very badly put together jigsaw puzzle. And no matter how long you look at it, it's not going to heal itself. You're going to have to take some pieces off the board, and then you're going to have to redistribute them elsewhere. But most of us, we see the breakdown of the systems. We see the mangled jigsaw puzzle. No matter what we do, we don't seem to be able to fix it. We put Band-Aids on stuff that need major surgery, and then we're scared that the whole system is going to dissolve. And so at some stage, we have to have the courage to intentionally, lovingly and intentionally dismantle existing systems, whether they're economic models, religious systems, pharmaceutical industry, science, religion, educational systems, entertainment systems, whatever they are, that are proving completely dysfunctional in our times, and rethink how we can do these going into the future. What kinds of frequencies we can radiate the data with so that a much more beautiful pattern emerges from us. And I keep going back to this beautiful passage from the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where Thomas says there are 6 stages to the evolutionary process: seeking, finding, being disturbed, marveling, ruling, and resting. And so as we continue on this journey of evolution, anybody who wants to be awake and who really wants to find the inner kingdom and identify the inner divinity and all that is, we have to have the courage to set out on the search, and we're guaranteed when we set out on the search, we're going to find new data. And when we find the new data, it's going to dismantle the old system. We're going to find that the old model, we can't tweak the old model anymore. It is radically inadequate. No matter how many changes we make to our political system, it's not working. And so no matter who you put in power, they're going to corrupt it anyway. And so we have to have the courage somehow to realize that we can retreat back to the safety of the old model, that we were brought up in, whether it's a belief in, that the Pope is infallible, or that only Catholics go to heaven. We can retreat to that and feel good and safe. Or we can have the courage to have the rug pulled out from underneath us, and to be really disturbed at the situation in which we find ourselves. We're in free fall at this stage. But at some stage, the free fall leads to the marveling, the realization that maybe for the first time in my life, I'm free. I'm free to kind of assemble the data in a much more meaningful pattern than I'd been taught, the one that was only possible and only real. I know at that stage I rule because I have control of my trajectory. I know where my destiny is now. I'm plugged into a GPS system, which is a God positioning satellite as to bring me home. And that finally then I can rest in the realization that there is only God. And when God is finished with this game, she'll just fold it up and dream a brand new game. And so what I see when I look around is that, it's not that everything is collapsing, it's that the unsustainable parts of the system are collapsing. And so we have to realize that those parts that are working, if there are parts that are working still, those parts will continue to work and they'll be part of the final configuration. It's not that when you're doing the jigsaw puzzle and you reach an impasse that you have to dismantle everything, including the corner pieces and the straight edges. They're working perfectly. You don't have to dismantle those. You only have to dismantle the pieces which were wrongly combined. And so what is unsustainable in our world is going to collapse under the weight of its own insufficiency, and then the other parts will survive, and whether we can recombine existing elements. And so I keep saying it's an epigenetic model. And epigenesis is the realization that all subsequent stages of an evolutionary process incorporate but transcend all previous stages. So it sheds that which is not important anymore, like a tree shedding its leaves. They've done what they've come to do. They've given chlorophyll to the root system. Now they're going to give kind of fertilizer to the root system by falling off and mulching the ground near the tree. So they're still part of the process of evolution, but we're waiting for a brand new set of leaves to arrive in the springtime. And so the key to this entire process then, I believe, is the change of consciousness. It is the only route to ultimate change, changing of consciousness to real evolution. Otherwise, we're just changing kind of what would you call it? What, surgery when you're just trying to look better. Is the word I'm looking for. Plastic surgery. Otherwise, we're doing plastic surgery on ourselves. So where we need to do radical surgery on ourselves. And I give you the example of my time in Kenya, where I was involved in water projects on a regular basis, living as I did in a semi-desert area, and on most occasions having very successful outcomes, where we piped water from the source to a village, over maybe 1 or 2 years it would take a project, but on 2 occasions failing miserably, because in one project, a warrior had punched holes in the pipe that was delivering water to the village, and when we turned on the faucet in the village square, there was no water because the pipes, had been broken. So for that for me represented, faulty systems or faulty structures. And then a second project where We successfully piped water from a source to a village, but we turned on the water, everybody drank copiously, and 4 or 5 days later, everybody in the village was down with dysentery because the source from which we took the water was polluted. Not intentionally, we didn't realize that. And so the water represents the people who staff the organizations and the structures. So you need to have transformed people in transformed systems in order for it to work. If any one of them is not working, you can have good people in a bad system, and they'll be ineffective. Or you can have bad people in a good system and they just corrupt the consumer. So as Jesus very famously said, new wine, new wineskins. And that's for our times. The new wine of the next stage of human evolution needs new wineskins, new kinds of organizations of humanity. Now, we're moving then from, in the science world, we're moving from a Newtonian Cartesian kind of an effort at science to a science based on a much more quantum mechanical version. And the Newtonian version is based on a kind of ontologically discrete separation. So everything is separate from everything else. There's Jupiter there, and there's Mars there, and there's the Milky Way galaxy there, and there's one tree over here, and there's a bunny rabbit over there, and we're all separated from each other. So Newtonian Cartesian model is predicated on separation, ontological discrete differences. Quantum mechanics is based on entanglement and union. And I believe we're at the initial stages of the quantum mechanical revolution. So this is not just through, of the physical cosmos in which we live. It's true, much more importantly, in the metaphysical cosmos of which we're a part. And so it's based on entanglement and superposition, as I was saying this morning, and on union. And so that's the movement, the scientific leg of the movement forward. Now, at a biological level, the old notion that evolution was based on cellular change, that we thought that, it was cellular activity that drove, evolution on planet Earth. And that was devastated by the Human Genome Project, this extraordinary project that seemed to want to figure out the number of genes in the human body. Now, the human body has about 70 trillion cells, whereas a lowly worm has about 1,200 cells. So we got 70 trillion cells, and they got about 1,200 cells. But at the end of the Human Genome Project, we found out that both humans and worms have basically 20,000 genes. We have about 23,000 actually. So basically the same number of genes. So an evolutionary model predicated on cellular activity is going nowhere fast. You can't account for the differences of evolution based on our cellular activity, on our genetic makeup in the sense of just our genome. There are a lot more factors that involved here. And so that takes us into the metaphysical arena. So then this spiritual evolution, I believe, it's a spiritual evolution. It's not a spiritual revolution. Revolution is always violent. It gets results very, very quickly, and it just leads to more violence. There's a temporary fix by adopting a violent mindset. And once you adopt a particular outcome, you realize very, very quickly, violence works. And I saw that so many times in Africa during my time there, that violent revolutions to overthrow colonialist regimes, once they succeeded, they realized violence works. And now there's, civil warfare between various groups of freedom fighters, and you get civil wars going on for 30 or 40 or 50 years afterwards. Like in East Africa right now, there's still wars going on in an area where the Portuguese had been kicked out, in the 1960s. And so what we need is spiritual evolution, not spiritual revolution, which does not mean that we can't confront evil. One level of compassion is the courage to confront that which is not right, but to do it out of a loving heart. Even when we confront, it's done from a loving space. So to go back to a final image then, this beautiful image again of the caterpillar cocooning itself and disintegrating into this goo, and resisting, even though it's been driven by some kind of an internalized image. It resists the kind of the disintegration of the self, and that very fight, that very struggle, creates new imaginal cells that result in a butterfly. And I actually, over the last 2 months, I put a notice on my mirror in my bathroom. I have an image of a goo, this goo, and an image of a butterfly, and one statement that says "Global Goo, let's create a butterfly." And so that's the first message I give myself every morning when I go into the bathroom. I look at the global goo of which you're a part, and I think, okay, how can we create a butterfly out of this mess? Great question. So, Lena's question was about, we all seek safety. So how can we activate courage in order to make the kinds of decisions which are not predicated just upon being safe economically or physiologically or whatever? The very first step we have to take is the disidentification with the ego. As long as I'm identified with my ego, I'm identified with a spacesuit. And therefore, the safety of the spacesuit and the health of the spacesuit becomes primary in my thinking. And a great Hindu mystic at one stage said, all human suffering lies in the gap between the ego and the soul. In that tiny gap, all human suffering lies in that gap. And so it's the identification with ego that creates all of these rules of engagement. And so my job is to protect my ego, not only to protect my ego, to inflate my ego. I got to impress upon you how good I am, or how bright I am, or how accomplished I am. And so my job is both to protect it and to inflate it. And as long as I keep, identifying with that, I'm stuck with the issue. Now, when I realize that by virtue of my incarnation, I volunteered and you volunteered and everybody volunteered to come here to raise the planet to Christ consciousness. But in the absence of the struggle, there's no growth possible. I spoke yesterday about this little boy who came across a monarch butterfly that's trying to work its way out of its cocoon, and it's struggling mightily and appearing to go and get nowhere. And the kid is, mesmerized, and at the same time filled with compassion, and feels, I need to help this creature out, and start very delicately breaking the cocoon to release the butterfly. And he does. He liberates the butterfly, and he cripples it in the process, because it is the struggle to get out of the cocoon that secretes the lactic acid into the wing structure of the butterfly. So now the butterfly is liberated, but it is flightless. It's handicapped for the rest of its life. And so we're all cocooned in the incarnational spacesuits. And it is a struggle to get our way out of that releases the lactic acid of deep, deep love into the mission. So we have to realize that suffering is an invitation to self-transcendence, that every problem, as an old man in Africa told me at one stage when, as a young 26-year-old Irish missionary, I was going to sort out all their problems for them. And he said to me, why is it for you Europeans that your only response to a problem is to want to solve it? And I'm kind of gobsmacked, what else do you do with a problem? And he said to me, a problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And if all you do is solve it, life will just give you another problem. And so it's this kind of the game we have to learn to disidentify with the ego and start birthing God, and to realize that we signed up for this struggle, because the struggle is the only way to release the lactic acid of love into the wing structure of incarnation. And so this is a gift we set ourselves. This is not a problem we kind of blindsidedly walked into.
I wanted to ask, and it is kind of because I had this comment from somebody. How would you respond? So there's a big, diversity and inclusion effort going on in a lot of companies. And so how would you kind of respond from this perspective of, realizing that we're all one, when groups of people want to see, kind of more recognition and more kind of apology for, past structures and systems that maybe haven't worked so well. Specifically, I'd had a woman reach out to me who's with a diversity and inclusion group with a big oil and gas company. And she was responding to something I'd written, an article I'd written about imposter syndrome. And she was saying, well, she basically was saying, if you're not a Black person within an organization, sure, maybe you could look at kind of, personal responsibility, but all of our systems are set up in a way, particularly in the business world, which almost makes it impossible for them to, that this was her statement. I haven't quite responded to it yet, but I'm just curious on your perspective, because yes, there have been, I think, systems in past that have been very, not fair, but how would you respond to something like that?
This is a very fraught issue for very, very many different reasons. And I have certainly very strong opinions on everything. I gave an entire retreat about 2 or 3 years ago on the problem of evil. and I talked about slavery in particular. So I'll address just a few parts of it, but I don't want to get too political on it. But I will say that any effort to separate people on the basis of accidental kind of characteristics, is just another form of exclusion and racism. And so I take Martin Luther King's very, very seriously, that he hoped to live in an America in which his children would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And that's kind of one part. We're doing the opposite at this stage. We're creating artificial dividers and creating new forms of separation. We're trying to create a system based not on meritocracy, that the person who's most qualified for the job is the person who gets it. We're having big problems right now, for instance, in the air industry with unqualified pilots, having near misses because they're being promoted on the basis of this new effort rather than on their merits as pilots or whatever. So I have to be really, really careful that we're putting people into positions. I don't want a surgeon who yesterday was a car mechanic, taking out my gallbladder. Yeah. And so I want to look at one of the ways around this is the realization that you can take any one of these subcomponents, like, for instance, slavery. And obviously slavery was an extraordinary kind of a violence visited on people. But when you look at the slave trade, you have to look at the various components of the slave trade. If, for instance, you have somebody who's addicted to fentanyl right now, and so this is a young kid who's using fentanyl, he's likely to kill himself. Now, is this only his problem? Is the people who took the fentanyl across the Mexican border, is it their responsibility? Is it the Chinese government who's exporting it to Mexico and bringing it across? Is it their responsibility? So is it the kind of the provider here who's selling it to the kid here? So who's responsible for this fentanyl addiction? Who's responsible for the slave trade in the 16, 17, 1800s? And I look at various components. So you have got, to use crude language, you've got the end user. You've got the kind of the farmer in kind of the southern states who's using slave labor, but he bought it from somebody who's selling the slaves in the market. So who's responsible? Is it the end user? Is it the guy who sold it to him? The guy who's selling it bought it from slave traders who came across the Atlantic in slave ships. So is it the ship owner that's responsible for this? In West Africa particularly, they took these slaves from the coast of West Africa. Who provided the slaves to the ship owners? It was African leaders, African chiefs raiding other African groups and providing slaves for the slave trade. So who's responsible for slavery? Every one of those pieces. If those African chiefs, hadn't been interested in whatever gain they got from selling their own people, there would be no slave trade. If the people who owned the ships refused to kind of transport them, there'd be no slave trade. If the guy who picked them up at the other side refused to sell them, there'd be no slave trade. If the farmer refused to use them, there'd be no slave trade. So when you examine any one of these issues, you have to really look at the entire history of it and realize it takes a lot of people to create, that level of criminality. And my contention is, at this stage, we're just substituting one level of discrimination for a different level of discrimination, and we're going to pay a huge price by kind of empowering and promoting people who are very unqualified for the jobs they're being given. And we're seeing this happen in the banking industry right now in Silicon Valley here. And the second thing I would say to it is this. When I finally adopted the understanding of reincarnation because of personal experiences I had, I came to the realization that reincarnation is the best possible explanation and antidote to all forms of discrimination. And I wrote several short stories about this. So I had an experience at one stage, I grew up as a little kid going to cowboy and Indian movies. And even as a 5-year-old kid, I always considered myself an Indian. I was really upset that the Indians were portrayed as these kind of stupid savages that just run round and round in circles while the cowboys circled the wagons, and just got picked off, by the cowboys. Just stupidly just paid to their faces and riding in circles and getting killed. I always identified with the Indians. It always upset me when the Indians lost an engagement, even as a 5-year-old kid. So I wrote a story about 5 or 6 years ago about an incarnational experience where I realized that a cowboy who's now killing Indians may have been an Indian, who was killed by the cowboys. That reincarnationally, we're experiencing all facets of any situation. And therefore, to become prejudiced at any stage against any player in the drama is to forget that I've been in all of the other positions previously. So the question becomes then, okay, I'm in this now particular configuration at this stage. I'm male, I'm white, I'm heterosexual, I'm Catholic, I believe in God. That's 5 strikes against me right now in the America in which I live. You know, if I'd been gay, you know, and trans and kind of a person of color and didn't believe in God, you know, everybody would be rooting for me. And so I had to realize, okay, that's the configuration I'm playing right now. At one stage, the configuration I had would have been kind of lauded and say, oh my God, he's a priest, he's going to Africa, he's saving sinners, wow, wow, wow. And then you get the pedophilia character and all priests are painted with the pedophilia brush. He's a Catholic priest, he must be a weirdo. I know, you know, at this stage, I epitomize all that's wrong and all that's kind of victim. And I'm the arch villain in the piece at this stage, and everybody I meet is my victim. So that's how the situation is changing. Any situation that creates winners and losers, victims and victimizers, refuses to understand what incarnation is about and what reincarnation is about and what mission is about. So I just have to harvest the situation in which I find myself now. I harvested a situation 50 years ago in which I was a hero. You know, I'm harvesting a situation this time in which I'm a villain. How am I going to deal with that? I got to play the cards that I'm being dealt at this stage. And what I would say, everybody, you have a hand of cards and, you know, play the hand that you're dealt right now. You know, and as the kind of dealer gives you a new card, play with the new card. Make the best fist you can of the new card.